This picture of Jesus as Good Shepherd, is a popular image. Even people who are unsure of their faith seem to be drawn to it. I particularly like it. I'm someone who is directionally challenged, both physically and spiritually, and anybody who's ever traveled anywhere with me knows I have a knack for getting lost. And there's something soft and gentle about knowing Jesus as the Good Shepherd that brings a sense of peace. I'm also particularly fond of sheep. To me, they have a certain charm. On a trip around the British Isles a few years ago, I was excited to see so many sheep. And George was the photographer, so as we traveled along, I would say to him, "Oh, look at those sheep. Take a picture of those sheep." Well, by the time we got through Wales, where we were told sheep outnumber people 3-1, we had lots of pastoral scenes of grazing sheep. But actually, I know very little about sheep, or shepherds for that matter. So as I prepared this, I did a bit of research, and what I learned made me realize that it's no wonder God calls us the sheep of his pasture. Sheep, like people, have different personalities, different needs. They can be aggressive or meek, rebellious, or easily frightened. They like to get their own way, but they're helpless on their own. They'll follow a bolder sheep, unaware of the consequences or any possible danger. If attacked, their only means of defense is to run away, which, if they're panicking, is a dangerous thing to do and could lead to injury. Of all the livestock, sheep are the most needy. They need the watchful care of a good shepherd. Prone to wander with no way to fight off predators, they depend on the shepherd for survival. So naturally, because they are so dependent, a bond develops between sheep and shepherd. Not only do they come to know the shepherd's voice, but they also can recognize faces, and they come to recognize the shepherd's face. And to hear his voice and to see his face calms them. Sheep hate to be driven. They will follow when led. And to this day, in the Middle East, a shepherd leads his sheep. And in Israel, the land can be rough, barren, and dangerous. Not like the grassy slopes of Ireland. A capable shepherd will know where to graze the sheep and how to protect them. So when we look at our passage today, and Jesus begins with these words, "I am the good shepherd." This is a metaphor that speaks to his care for Israel. Israel had a long history of understanding God as their shepherd and understanding that God appointed priests as to be shepherds to care for his sheep, a role they didn't always do well, and not always according to God's expectations. They could often be harsh and intimidating, as we see in the chapter before this when Jesus healed the man born blind. They treated the man very poorly. And Jesus challenged them on that for their lack of care and compassion. Jesus says, "I am the good shepherd." And it's also another one of these I am statements that John gives us, an echo of God revealing himself to Moses centuries before. It points to Jesus' own divinity, and it points to Jesus as God's true shepherd of Israel. John also uses a word for good that is the Greek word kalos to describe his shepherd. The word implies more than just good in the everyday sense that we would think of it. There's a loveliness, a beauty, and a purity, a moral goodness, someone with the best of intentions. It's a goodness so beautiful as to be irresistible. That is how the Good Shepherd tends his sheep, with the utmost care. Jesus, as Good Shepherd, compares himself to a hired hand. At the first sign of trouble, the hired hand abandons the sheep. To the hired hand, the sheep are nothing more than a means to make a living. And as Jesus says, he cares nothing for the sheep. He puts his own needs first. And again, Jesus' words about the hired hand are similar to God's condemnation of the leaders in Israel at the time, whose responsibility it was to tend the sheep. In contrast, Jesus describes his own relationship as a deep commitment. He knows his sheep. They know him by the sound of his voice. They come to him knowing he will provide for them and protect them. They know they'll be safe with him. And Jesus wants the people of Israel to know that they are his sheep, that they can be as close to him as he is to the Father. They can have the same intimate relationship, the same deep love with him that he has with the Father. He will never abandon them. He's quite prepared to die to save them. And he says this: the Good Shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. So when we know Jesus as our shepherd, when we know how he loves and cares for us, and how much we need his care, it seems that should be enough to draw us closer to him. After all, isn't that what we all want? To be loved and cared for? And what more could we possibly need? But Jesus doesn't stop there. Four times in these few verses, he says, the Good Shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. His Father asks him to do this as an expression of his Father's own love for the world. And Jesus, out of love for both the Father and the sheep, does as he's asked. It's a wondrous act of love, and it reaches out in all directions. This is God's plan to save his creation. And it calls for obedience on Jesus' part. But Jesus trusted God's plan and was able to surrender. He surrendered his own will to that plan. He makes it very clear that his life is not taken from him. He surrenders it himself. Centuries earlier, David, Israel's greatest king and a shepherd himself, wrote Psalm 23. He was inspired to know the Lord as his shepherd. There are times when I read Psalm 23, and like Rebecca said, I'm one of those people that has it memorized. And after the first 3 verses, I feel I want to stop and just rest there. It's like gazing at our window here. We can get quite sentimental. It's a comforting picture, after all. Jesus holding a lamb close to his heart. But when it comes to the psalm, I'm not quite as comfortable moving on to the dark and shadowy valley. But David knew, and Jesus knew, that being a shepherd wasn't just about safety and comfort. It was a dangerous job, and sheep needed to be guided through the darkness. Jesus, our shepherd, intends to lead us through all the dark and troubling times of our lives. The desert places, the lonely places, the rough places. And he can do that. He can lead us through the dark valley of the shadow of death because he's gone that way before us. He did lay down his life for his sheep, and he came through to resurrection life. His desire as our shepherd is that we allow him to walk with us through the darkness to that new life. But then Jesus says one more thing here. I have other sheep. I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there will be one flock and one shepherd. Jesus isn't content to tend just the sheep in Israel. His plan is for the flock to increase, to include those outside the boundaries, or perhaps to remove the boundaries altogether. One sheep pen, one shepherd. Of course, Jesus came for the world, for all nations. One thing we've seen in this pandemic, if we were blind to it before, is how tenuous and fragile are the living conditions of so many people. Marginalized, scattered, lost, often desperate sheep without a shepherd. And add to that the fact that we live in a world full of voices that just seem to get louder and more numerous. In the confusion of our modern world, what voices are people listening to? And what voices are they following? So much to sort out, so many ways to go astray. Jesus, our good shepherd, wants to bring in the sheep that aren't yet in the safety of his pen, and he wants us to help him. One thing about following the shepherd is we learn from him. We learn to be like him. We learn to be the voice and the action of a shepherd who cares well for those sheep who feel lost or abandoned. We learn to love as he loves, to show that love to others is what draws them into the shelter of the fold. Not pushed. Remember, sheep don't like to be driven, but led and guided into trying another direction. Because no matter how far they've strayed, the Good Shepherd wants them back.